Okay, let's begin our program. So, this evening, we have the great pleasure of welcoming back into our midst for a second session, Dr. Bill Leonard. We will again be talking about Baptist identity, as we have done in some form or fashion all 3 Wednesday nights of January so far. As I introduced him last time, Dr. Leonard is former Dean of Wake Forest University Divinity School and now Professor Emeritus of Church History there, among lots of other things in Baptist life and in North Carolina life and indeed in American life. This evening, he will lead us in how to speak about Christian nationalism. And in this day and age, it is very important that we learn, I believe, to articulate what Christian nationalism is, that we learn how to speak about it, in part so that we can learn to speak to it, because it is quite a powerful force in religious ideology in our world, in our culture, and certainly in politics. So how do we as Christians, and particularly tonight, how do we as Baptist Christians speak to, with an intelligent understanding of Christian nationalism, and how do we claim as Baptists and proclaim religious liberty in a world that has witnessed January 6th, 2021, among many other instances of an outgrowth of this ideology of Christian nationalism. So without any other words from me, I'm happy to welcome to the microphone Dr. Bill Leonard.
Well, thank you, Catherine. It's a joy to be back with you tonight. I have to tell you, this morning, our daughter Stephanie, who many of you know and love, and who's been here with me before, woke up and came in for breakfast, and she said, "Aren't you going back to Knollwood tonight?" I said, "Yes," and she said, "Good, you'll get a check, won't you?" We have taught her well. And so I said, well, I'm not sure. And so I'm not sure. So tonight I took a cookie, just in case that's all there is. What Ben said to you tonight, I hope you know about the church has never been as strong. And I say this without any humor to it. There are very few churches in the United States of America across the theological and denominational spectrum that could make that confession on a night like this, at this moment in time. And I mean that deeply. And I clapped along with the rest of you, because that is so unique. And I hope you know that and celebrate it, because it needs to be celebrated and to be, pray God, continued. So thank you for having me tonight. We're going to talk about Christian nationalism, and a term that has really, it's been around for a long time, but it has come of age at this moment in time in American Christianity. And so I'm going to jump right in. I put the kitchen sink in here, and I don't need to get through it all, but Catherine will be posting this for you to use, and if I don't get to the end of it, you'll see it'll be self-explanatory for you to use. We start really by reaching back where we went 2 weeks ago, and that is to our Baptist forebears, Thomas Helwys and John Smythe. And I want you to know they wrote this in 1612 and Smythe around 1610. That's 400 years plus. And I'm going to say this about them now and about Roger Williams when we get to him. I stay in awe of these kinds of folks because they saw in the 17th century what very few other people saw. It was that radical. And as we'll see tonight, what people 400 years later, some people in this country 400 years later, still have not seen. So, let's read that together. Let's start with Smythe in 1612, when they went back to England from Amsterdam. Read that first quote out loud. And he cites Romans 12 there. Now, Smythe, read that.
Let the king judge. Is it not most people that men should choose their religion themselves, seeing they only must stand themselves before the judgment seat of God to answer for themselves, when there shall be no excuse for them to say, we were commanded to be of this religion by the king or by them that have authority from him.
Amazing. Did I turn this off again? I'm consistent. Oh, there you go. Okay. I'll just use the old-fashioned way. Christian nationalism defined. And I'm going to read this to you and you follow along. This is the definition or description of Christian nationalism that comes from the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. So, and they have taken up the gauntlet to respond to this issue and make it the centerpiece of their identity here and now because of the seriousness of all this. Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. Christian nationalism contends that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian from top to bottom in its self-identity, interpretations of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, and public policies. And it aims to keep it that way. But the Christian in Christian nationalism is more about identity than religion. I wish they'd said faith. It carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. So that starts us out this evening. As we talk about this, let's look at some contemporary issues that have raised this in the culture in the last decade or so. One was that concern of many people about the war on Christmas, which really was a culture religion in its own way. And then I have to tell you, and I don't think I said this the last time, I've become very hesitant to speak about, to use the phrase, separation of church and state. And to use the term religious liberty or religious freedom more than that term, primarily because of tax exemption that churches get and the quote-unquote housing allowances that ordained ministers, Christian or not, rabbis and imams get it too, but that's given them as a tax break that people who work in nonprofits do not receive. So I'm hesitant to talk about, particularly now, because it's gotten so jumbled. So I tend to talk about religious liberty, religious freedom. And one of the things that's arisen from certain folks in the country is that Christians are being persecuted. And to some extent, we'll explore some reason about this, but part of that is the challenge of pluralism, that Christians feel that some Christians feel that their particular cultural status has been challenged and undermined because of the developing religious pluralism in the country, and because of the loss of what I would call Protestant privilege. Meaning, and I've talked with you, I think, about this some time ago, what I have called the changing sociology of Sunday that has impacted religious life in the country and challenged the privileging of Sunday that was given to Christian groups for such a long time. And people say, what do you mean by to define this changing sociology of Sunday? I give you a one-word definition: soccer. And I get an amen from most of you, don't I? And then we've seen these cases, the bakers who, as Christians, challenged same-sex marriage in asking for and receiving from the Supreme Court the opportunity, the right, not to facilitate same-sex marriages because of their stand on that. That many of them will do other things relative to same-sex couples, but not marriage. I keep looking for this, and I haven't seen a thing about that's their decision and their heart, and they have every right to take it to court. But I've never seen any of them say, with the parenthesis, and divorced couples, divorced and remarried couples too. As the old preacher said, Jesus don't say nothing about same sex, but he says a lot about divorce, and it ain't pretty. And so I keep wondering why, if these principles are so strong, why they only apply to this issue and not to the question of divorce. As the old serpent handler said to me, you know, when you talk about divorce, Jesus is the one who's doing the talking. So there you have it. And questions that came up a few years ago about deity-specific prayers at government meetings. I think that happened here at city council meetings or school board meetings or whatever. And people either are being determined that Christians should be, and they are, the primary prayers at those kinds of gatherings. And then the most famous one is the judge, the football coach, who wanted to have post-game prayers on the 50-yard line. And even the Supreme Court missed the writing of the opinion, missed the fact that large numbers of people, some even climbed over fences to get together. And the Supreme Court ruling sounded as if it was a one-person singular action, when it was not and had not been for some time. And then a growing number of persons concerned to bring tax support and choice for public schools and religion-based schools. And those of us who've been Baptists for more years than we can count, remember when that was the bottom line, the line in the sand for Baptists, that tax money would not go to anybody's school, Catholic or Protestant, religious school. But those have come up. And so, is America a Christian nation? I've said, as a historian, if you're talking about the early days of the colonial period and even in the beginnings of the colonies, it was probably more historically correct to say Protestant nation. if you were going to do it. Because except for Maryland, the Catholics weren't welcome most any other place. And now you hear the term, well, America has always been a Judeo-Christian nation, but the great historian Martin Marty, writing on the modern American church, discovered that the term Judeo-Christian was not used in the public square to refer to that linkage until the late 19th century, around the 1890s or so. So it's a relatively new term as well. Or others have added that it may be a more Abrahamic nation, meaning the three Mideastern religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. But it is it's really was in many ways from the beginning, though not actualized, and certainly now a pluralistic nation. But it's amazing to me that people are concerned that other religions are going to, you know the phrase from Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. Infamous. Because Jews and Muslims right now are somewhere between 1 and 2 and maybe a little bit of 3%, depending on where you're studying. So it's not like they're a lot. And we'll get into this whole dominion issue toward the end. There are types of Christian nationalism that I discovered in this research laid out, and I'll go through them with you. There's what is called God and country conservatism. So it's not a monolithic movement at all. God and country conservatism, which takes what we would call popular historicism of America as a Christian nation. An implicit reading of American history. And you find from the beginning these phrases that come and go in American life, that ways of talking about American exceptionalism from a religious perspective, God's new Israel, Redeemer nation, manifest destiny, not quite religious, but with religio-cultural overtones. And then a kind of Christian exceptionalism as divinely ordained. The second type is old guard religious conservatives who are anti-separationist in terms of church-state. And this would include groups like the Family Research Council, the SBC since 1990, Pat Robertson, David Barton, Eric Metaxas, names you may hear or you can Google, that is really bound up in fundamentalist dogma with particular emphasis on biblical inerrancy, that the Holy Scriptures are not only authoritative, but they are historical in every topic they discuss. And then the effort to have Christian nationalism dictate values, laws, and politics. A third is where apocalypticism spills out of popular Christianity into conspiracy theories. The MAGA group, various facets of the MAGA group, and QAnon. And I have a theory that if I get time, I may try to study that premillennial dispensational eschatology, that idea that Jesus would return, that the church would be raptured, and that there would be before the 1,000 years, there would be a tribulation period. That speculation, which was present in America in the colonial period, I think the Mather family were known for being premillennials, but took off with what became the Adventist movement in the 1820s and 30s in this country. That kind of speculative eschatology was a kind of formative ideology on the way to these much more speculative. And that would include Michael Flynn and the Tennessee preacher Greg Locke, who have written a lot about this and talked about taking up arms, possibly, to help bring in the kingdom. And then a fourth are what sometimes called online extremists. There's a bumper crop of that these days. Persons who use the internet to promote their views and link Christian nationalism with anti-Semitism, with white supremacy, and militarism. And Rick Fuentes and Kanye West are the public faces of this. And then a movement I'm only beginning to study calls itself the New Apostolic Reformation, the NAR. And this is a Pentecostal charismatic subgroup that carries biblical, I would say it this way, that features biblical inerrancy live. And that is that the Holy Spirit has called out certain apostles or prophets who receive direct revelation from God that instructs them how to build the kingdom of God or the new society of Christians on earth. And this is, and it's bound up in dominion theology. It's a subgroup of what's called dominion theology. Dominionism or dominion theology really appears with a man named Rushdoony in the late 20th century. And that is essentially an understanding of American government as requiring a theocracy, meaning that Christianity becomes the authoritative framework for shaping public morals, public policy, and laws, and the like. And Rushdoony is kind of elaborated on, he wasn't necessarily so Pentecostal charismatic, by another generation of prophets who developed what is sometimes called, or what is often called, it's called Seven Mountain Dominionism. And that is, and this is a quote from one source, believers, Christian believers, are to take control over the 7 leading aspects of American culture. Look at this list: family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. And in one sense, it's that electing persons are choosing community leaders or focusing on the leading classes in the country should intentionally involve Christians. And Christians should put themselves, Christians within this movement should put themselves into these leadership cultural areas in order that the whole society then is Christianized. And that's a kind of labeling of the nature of culture in a thoroughly theocratic model. And these folks are active tonight, here and now. This is going on. And then another kind of group of linking patriots and theocrats. That means adding Christian nationalism to hypermasculinity and the possibility of using insurrection to restore Christian government and to interpret inerrant, quote-unquote, biblical texts in ways that promote militarism and warfare. I'm going to stop a minute and see. This is heavy stuff, and you all look exhausted already. So, and don't spend a lot of time on this, please, because we want to move on. But are there any particular qualifying questions to ask that might give you a little sense of this, or has this been at least briefly clear enough? Yes. Did I say American? No, it's the New Apostolic Reformation, meaning, thank you for that, meaning Yes, it has worldwide implications, particularly. But it also says God is raising up a new generation of apostles/prophets who will receive direct revelation from God about how this is to be carried out. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes?
Read the First Amendment of the Constitution that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting free exercise thereof. This is in reaction to the Church of England, which was a government broad-sponsored church. But it's been broad, so broadly to say any aspect of government relationship to religion is improper.
Yes, I think. No, you're correct, and you're getting at it. It's not just Anglicanism that was written about, because with the exception maybe of the Netherlands in the 17th century, every European country had an established church. England, the Anglicans were in England, but there were Lutherans in Germany, there were Calvinists in Switzerland, Reformed theology folks in Switzerland. You can kind of run the list. And in Eastern Europe, from 1066, the Orthodox Church, which was the state church in all of those Eastern European countries. And this is unique in the world, that a country would begin by writing into its government principles the idea that Congress or the state will not set the boundaries of religious or irreligious identity. Correct?
I think it's safe to say that these don't exist like in silent, that oftentimes these different groups overlap.
Thank you. They do overlap.
I see it all the time.
No, they overlap, and I meant to say that as well. These are fluid boundaries, and many of these people incorporate multiple pieces of what we've laid out just organizationally, so I'd give you an overview. Okay, let's move on. Now, with all that in mind, let's look at some of the culture war influences on Christian nationalism. And I'm just going to run this list, and we can come back to it if we need to. One, the serious growth of religious pluralism. That is, other religious communities that are in this country, from Jews, Muslims, and Buddhists to serpent handlers, Mormons, and a whole bunch of other groups that either parallel or have pieces inside Christianity and then beyond. But with that, really with the beginnings of the 21st century, we have a parallel impact, and that is from the demographic declines in Christianity, the rise of what is sometimes called the nones, N-O-N-E-S, or nones, those growing number of persons who claim no religious affiliation. And that's right now about 30% of the population. Really close to the beginnings of the 21st century, when Gallup did this study for years, that group was 7 or 8%. And now every year, there's been some recent studies that it may have leveled off, but pretty much every year it's gone up since 2000. And we've said the loss of Christian cultural privilege, we've already talked about that. And then concerns about culture, social movements, women's roles, LGBTQ+, abortion, interfaith networks, public schools, immigration, minorities, and replacement theories and their efforts. And I think underneath much of this is the rise of fundamentalist dogmatism grounded in the idea, the concept, the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. We should have known this when the Southern Baptists were going all through this, and when we were packing our bags, and that, that is that whenever you have an inerrant doctrine or an inerrant document or an inerrant Bible, you're going to have an inerrant interpreter. And that's what's really happened within the SBC. They've moved beyond the Bible, to saying we are the ones who are the true Orthodox folks. And in my experience, they're not welcoming and affirming. And what I mean by that is, fundamentalism, as I have known it, tends to be a group of people who start defining the doctrine with themselves in it. And then if those come to join, they'll give you something to sign about every month. And when you finally reach the point where you can't sign nothing more, they'll say, see, we knew you were not Orthodox in the first place. Southwest Baptist College in Bolivar, Missouri, about a year, maybe two, no more ago, required all of their faculty to sign the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 document, the Confession of Faith. But they required the philosophy and religion departments to sign 5 different doctrinal statements if they were going to teach there, and fire you if you don't sign them, and if they decide you're not following them. So that's how strange it's become. And I think as well, one of the things that's terrified, particularly the Southern Baptists, is their old ways of doing evangelism are dying, or have died in many cases. And when the fundamentalists came to the Southern Baptist Convention, they said, if you get rid of all the liberal, moderate types, we will continue to grow, and we won't go the way of the Methodist, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians. And one of the great concerns for them now is almost, well, they started declining in the 1970s, I think. But from 2000 on, they have declined every year. And the average Southern Baptist, I may have told you this 2 weeks ago, is 55 years old. A recent study said that some 50% of young people under 30 who had been reared in the Southern Baptist Convention had left. And now I want to talk a bit about some history and give you the old-timey Baptist response to this whole Christian nation thing. And we have to start with Roger Williams. Williams, in 1636, is exiled by the New England Puritans, who were the theocrats, for, this is the list they made of charges, denying the idea of a Christian nation. Williams essentially said there are no Christian nations, only Christian people, bound to Christ not by citizenship, but by faith. That's number one. Number two, advocating for religious liberty for heretic and atheist alike. And I said this 2 weeks ago, this really is the seminal phase of what became American religious pluralism. And he got in even more trouble for saying the Native Americans were the real owners of the American land and should be justly compensated for it. And they said, goodbye. And he writes, in the howling wilderness of 1636, they ran him off from Massachusetts into what became Rhode Island, and he would have died out there if the Narragansett Indians hadn't saved him. And he bought land from them and established Providence and the First Baptist Church in America, 1638-39. And he also became a kind of missionary to the Native Americans, and he published the first lexicon of Native American language published and used in this country. A key to the language of America. And much of it is written in verse, and here's my favorite one. When Indians see the cruel ways of English, Irish men, their murderous oaths, their lying ways, then say these Indians then, we wear no clothes, have many gods, and yet our sins are less. You are barbarians, pagans wide. Your land's the wilderness. How did he see that in 1640? How did he do that? When almost nobody else did. John Clark, who founded the First Baptist Church in Newport, was a person like that. But I'm just in awe of him. And I told you last week, he did something else Baptists do. He became one, started a church, and then quit. And became a seeker because he felt like that there was no true revelation existing and God would have to give another one. But in the course of this, he had a debate with John Cotton, pastor of First Church, Congregational, Boston. Williams writes, the bloody tenet of persecution for the cause of conscience, in which he lays out in elaborate detail this idea that America is not a Christian nation, that there are no Christian nations in the world, and that the freedom of that uncoerced faith, as opposed to faith coerced by government, is the only way to truly know salvation. And John Cotton answered him back with the bloody tenet washed white in the blood of the Lamb. And I'll get to what he said in a moment. And Williams, not always wanting to have the last word, wrote another treatise called The Bloody Tenet, Yet More Bloody. So you all had dinner tonight. I'm sorry to raise that up. Williams said, government has no access to divinity. Government draws power from the people, but the church answers only to God. Israel was a chosen nation, but that was the only one God could stand. He gave it up with the coming of Christ. And the church has no power of the sword. Think of all the inquisitions. Only the power of the word. That ought to give all of us a chill down the back. The sanctity of conscience is essential to faith. No one should be prevented from worshiping as conscience dictates or compelled to worship if they don't feel that they should. Or forced to contribute to religion that contradicts their conscience. Conscience, then, is corrected only by persuasion, not by external force. And Christian magistrates, now look at this, are compelled, should be compelled, to protect even false religion. Or 17th century nuns, you see. Radical idea, but a clear understanding of at least what became Baptist understanding of the nature of religious freedom. Cotton, now I want you to pay attention to this because this is the whole issue of theocracy set in colonial Massachusetts. Cotton said, godly magistrates alone can regulate religion. The state should be undergirded with basic gospel truth, but not with intricate dogmas. The Puritans required conversion. They were among the first to require that every person who claimed membership in the church have a conversion experience. It came very late in Christian history. And that was a way of responding to the loss of Catholic and Anglican sacraments, where one took the body and blood of Christ literally into themselves. And when they gave up transubstantiation or real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, they had to come up with some way of objectifying faith. And they did that by requiring conversion. And they believed that the state should license churches and compel the unconverted to attend services and to call synods gatherings of church clergy. And without that linkage of church and state, moral chaos and disorder fostered by the non-elect, Cotton was a Calvinist, and the non-elect were totally depraved, had no chance of being saved, and the job of the government was to keep the non-elect from taking control of the Christian culture. Because the non-elect were totally depraved. I once had a student who asked, can you be partially, totally depraved? I wanted to say, only if you're Baptist. This is Cotton. If civil weapons be debarred from defending religion upon pretense that church weapons are sufficient, then no churches nor church weapons are to be found upon the face of the earth. Then let all seducers to apostasy, idolaters, and heretics, let them all rejoice in an open door of liberty and safety. That is, if you don't enforce Christianity, the totally depraved will take it over. And I give you this because it's a clear-cut 17th century description. Theocracy, or his definition, to make the Lord God our governor, is the best form of government in a Christian commonwealth. That form of government where the people who have the power of choosing their governors are in covenant with God, only Christians should vote. Wherein the men chosen by them are godly men and fitted with the spirit of government, in which the laws they rule are by the laws of God. That form of government in which the power of civil administration is denied unto unbelievers. You don't let non-converted people hold public office, and is committed to the saints, is the best form of government in a Christian commonwealth. I read an article in the Missouri Baptist paper Word and Way, which is just being adamant against Christian nationalism. And I haven't documented this, but they said that a couple of years ago, for some time, a Jewish individual was the Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives. And one of these folks in the movement that we're talking about confronted him on the floor of the House and said, "You should not be here," because he was not Christian. And I think that man was not I don't think that man was an elected official, but he's one of the major contributors to elect certain elected officials. John Clark and Roger Williams write the charter of Rhode Island, which is the first colony to give unbounded religious freedom. And here's the word. Now, you all read that out loud and let me get a drink of water. You need this in your mouths. Go ahead.
No person within said colony at any time hereafter shall be in any wise molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences of opinion in matters of religion. I, that all and any persons may, from time to time, and at all times hereafter, freely and fully have and enjoy his and their own judgments and consciences in matters of religious concerns throughout the tract of land hereafter mentioned.
Yeah. And I'll skip. John Leland, who's an 18th century Virginia preacher, was one of the people who just continued this effort and who lobbied Madison for amendments to the Constitution. And we're told, threatened to run against Madison for Congress and forced Madison to take some action by doing that. And here's what Williams says in his objection to the newly ratified, singular, unamended Constitution. There is no Bill of Rights. Whatever a number of persons enter into a state of society, a number of individual rights must be given up to society. But there should be a memorial of those not surrendered. What is clearest of all, religious liberty is not sufficiently secure. No religious test is required as qualification to fill any office under the United States. But if a majority of Congress with the President favor one system, does this sound familiar? One system more than another, they may oblige all others to pay to the support of their system more than another. Aid to public and religious-based schools. And if the manners of people are so far corrupted that they cannot live by Republican principles, it is very dangerous leaving religious liberty at their mercy. That's as relevant then as now. Or to say, that's as relevant now as then. And that's why I wanted you all to hear it. And here, we've already had, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to assemble or to petition the government for redress. Dissenting Protestantism joined in common cause with rationalism and deism. There's pluralism already to make religious liberty a constitutional right. And some of my teachers from afar and up close, William Lee Miller, William Warren Sweet, Edwin Scott Gaston, and W.R. Eastep, who preached at my ordination, taught me that in their writings or in their classes. What time do we have, Catherine?
We've got about 7 minutes.
Oh, let's stop here then. I'm going through and just let me just walk through here and show you. I'm laying out here, basically there are two primary approaches to freedom of religion. One is the separationist approach, which I've been talking about, and then there's the accommodationist view, where government supports no official national church, but accommodates religious communities as much as possible. And that's a sharp distinction between the separation. And then I quote Gausted, who was a Baptist and one of the finest human beings and historians I've ever known, about the role of dissent in all this, and I urge you to read this when this is posted. So let's quit here. Again, I think what we haven't talked about is self-explanatory. Comments, questions from you? What about the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and what we saw on January 6th and are now hearing as they go to trial? I am hopeful, but I am very concerned because the momentum, even though this is a minority, basically, in the country, maybe 20%, my fear is might be, I've seen some things that thought as many as 30, but certainly 20%. But I'm very concerned about that. And this is a whole nother question for another time. I'm also concerned about it because we live in a country armed to the teeth. And these are folks who have stored weapons. And you could make a blanket law or laws tomorrow, and it wouldn't stop the gun culture, because they're everywhere. And we're seeing that every day in this town. You all read the journal? Stephanie, Leonard, and I read the journal every morning. Somebody gets shot. They may not get killed or shot at. In this small city, multiply that across the country. That's what worries me about, and also the fact that they're beginning to find people, active or retired military, law officers, and the like. And so you don't know what's already been worked in some systems, and why. And I'm so glad you all talked to Catherine, and she invited us to talk about this tonight. But you can go home and turn on the news and hear the results of this right now. So that's why, and again, you can see how animated I get about this. I learned this from reading the Baptists. It's not like we're strangers to this as a community, but I look around and see Baptist after Baptist that write off Williams and pick up John Cotton. And part of it, and here's the theological issue, part of it is the theology of conversion became a transaction. And so many churches and movements in this country, evangelical movements, have stolen the life out of religious experience. It's what you know in your head and confess with the confession of faith. It's not necessarily, and they use the language of the heart, but they're way away from it. And so the loss of what Baptists used to call heart religion, and the inability of churches to find a replacement for the old walk the aisle evangelism. And as people get farther away from that kind of knowledge, because they haven't been coming to churches and they don't know the rituals and the meaning, it becomes harder and harder to make the case for the Jesus story as we once did. And we have to try to find new ways of being and living that out. Not simply in response to the gospel, but for the sake of the gospel in this country. Yes?
I think
Pastor.
you aren't speaking to this bill, but how would you articulate the church's mission or vocation in response to Christian nationalism?
I lost you at mission. How would
you articulate the church's mission in response to Christian nationalism?
I'll start with the Baptist Joint Committee. The Baptist Joint Committee is partnering with a large number of entities, one of which is the Freedom From Religion group of folks here. Roger Williams would have loved that. And they're Amanda Tyler, who is absolutely amazing. She has spoken before Congress. She's been on a variety of podcasts and news shows in representing Baptists wonderfully, but more than that even. And I get hopeful about the Baptist Joint Committee and the work they're doing. I really find that. And you all may be interested to know that out of the ruins of Baptist Seminary Richmond has come the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, based in Richmond right now, and directed by a young black woman, Sabrina Dent. And I'm on the board, as is Linda McKinnish Bridges and Bill Wilson and a number of people that you all know. They're taking up this issue in wonderful cross-racial podcasts and seminars and series, and in ways that I'm very excited about. And it's brand new. They took what was left of the endowment of BTSR to at least start this. And there are some new possibilities on the horizon that I think you'll be hearing about. But finding agencies that work together to do this in small gatherings like this, and then persons who push back against the public efforts to change this. And I'm not trying to be political, but one of the great choices is who you vote for. And gerrymandering and the whole like is causing real difficulty in terms of choosing leaders who don't have to campaign because they know they're going to get voted in anyway. And so it's a layered thing. And Bob, I think also deciding that churches have to, and here I'll get religious experience, and Knollwood for me represents that and has for a long time. What is the witness, whether it's political or not? Start with the witness that the church has. The early Baptists began this, what became religious pluralism, because uncoerced faith was the true faith. And that's where we're headed for this kind of, I call it neo-establishmentarianism. The witness of churches against that is extremely important and essential in a variety of ways, but simply trying to nurture religious experience and to live out religious experience in a way that people who are circling churches or driving right by them or writing them off can, whether they come or not, that's the witness you give as a witness against what some people see. One of the reasons people have left the SBC is they just sound so mean about all this. Because their witness is tainting all of us because it's so public. See, you got me preaching. We'll sing a hymn if you want me to. One more. Yes, sir.
What's, you said Southern Baptist, what's wrong with Southern Baptist? Because Knollwood is not Southern Baptist.
No, and thank you, that's a great question. I have been using the SBC, which I grew up in, but left in '92, as a case study that as the largest denomination, though declining rapidly in the country, it's a case study in how old values that dated back to Roger Williams got lost. People who said they were Christ against culture, Diane, ended up co-opting culture in ways that shaped their witness in the country. And so I know this isn't a SBC crowd. I wouldn't have been here if it was. But they're the case study, and because they have this large presence in the public square, they are setting agendas for us and for every Baptist group, left or right or center in the country.
Bill, do you miss James Dunn as much as we do?
Oh, my Lord. Oh, yes. Some days I miss James and Jesus. Yeah. And we may have said this 2 weeks ago, I think so. Some of my friends have said to me, you know, it's kind of a good thing that James ain't here because he'd have had a heart attack anyway. But he would have held some feet to the fire, the gospel fire. And part of what we have to do, thank you, it's a good way to quit. Part of what we have to do is incarnate Jesus and James Dunn. or saying that.